This is presentation 7 of 9 for season 2 of Bob Bailey's 19th Century Baseball Speaker Series. I always like to mention that this was very, very fortunate, Bob, that that you were here to recommend this. So anyway, I will say one word about that we do have a call for abstracts out for next season, and the season begins in September and runs through May. So season 3 of our 19th Century Baseball Speaker Series will again be once a month from September through 2022 through May of 2023, like an academic year. And probably in the next couple of weeks, I'll send a reminder and another version of that abstract. So I hope some of you take advantage of it. We've had some great people already. Some of them are already here online with us, but who have been presenters in the past. So Bob, with that being said, let me turn it over to you, and then I'll have some comments at the end about other things.
Thank you, Peter. First of all, everybody, please remember to mute yourself when the presentation starts. And if you have questions, use the chat button. Just run your cursor to the bottom of the black Zoom screen. There should be a chat button there. If there's not, just go to the right. There's a button that says More. If you click that, chat will be one of the options that you have on that. You can type in questions, comments, clever things your child has said this week, whatever it is that makes sense to you, and we will go from there. Now, tonight's speaker is Dennis Thiessen. Dennis has had a wildly successful career in academics. Currently, he's a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto in the Curriculum, Teaching, and Learning Department. He served as editor or regional editor for several journals, including the Journal of Education Policy, International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, and Curriculum Inquiry. He has numerous academic publications, all of which the vast majority of our audience has absolutely no interest. But he's also a baseball writer, which we do have an interest in, and a researcher. Recently has had a book published by McFarland titled Tip O'Neill and the St. Louis Browns of 1887. Material from that book is the basis for tonight's presentation. He'll be also appearing at this year's Frederick Ivor Campbell 19th Century Baseball Conference in Cooperstown, discussing the baseball career of 19th century St. Louis owner Chris Von der Eye. Tonight, Dennis will present his presentations titled Tip O'Neill, Champion Batsman of 1887. Dennis, if you'd like to take over and bring your slides up, we're ready to go.
Okay. I don't, sorry.
Run your cursor to the bottom to share screen.
I did do that.
Okay, and hit share and click that. Nothing's coming up?
Well, I don't see my file on it.
Is your file open?
Oh, you mean on the desktop?
Yeah.
That's probably why. Sorry, it's slow for some reason. Oh, here we are. Okay, we're getting there. Just a minute. Okay. Good evening, everyone.
You're not up yet. Your
Oh,
slides aren't up.
aren't they? Okay.
Hit share screen again. If your file is open, you can hit share screen.
Okay.
And it should show up in the dialog box.
Well, it's open, but I went the wrong way. Sorry. Geez, I did this last time.
You want me to come up?
I'm just going to have to go through. Just a minute. Okay. Um, I hit share screen again, and my file is open on the desktop, but it's not showing.
I'll come up.
There you go.
Just a minute.
Okay, you're on. You're good.
Okay, but
You guys got to go back. Got to go to full screen and go back to the first slide. There you go.
okay. Well, you see in the slides. Thank you very much. So, in any case, happy to be here speaking about Tip O'Neill and his season of 87. Maybe again, what the question was, who was Tip O'Neill? Well, outside of this group, when you ask that question, quite often you get Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House during the Carter and Reagan's administration. Well, of course, that's correct. But tonight I focus on the original Tip. That is the Canadian-born batsman who played left field for the St. Louis Browns in the American Association in the 1880s. There's a connection between the two Tips. The baseball Tip was the favorite player of the father of the Speaker Tip. The father called his son Tip when he was a young boy, and the name stuck throughout the Speaker's life and career. In the presentation tonight, I will focus on the original Tip, the champion batsman of the American Association in 1887, and some of his feats and achievements that year. I also will revisit David Nemec's assessment of that season, where he said, Tip O'Neill rocketed to perhaps the most dominant offensive season in history. Along the way, I will comment on the St. Louis Browns and their style of play and their success in the last half of the 1880s. Tip was at the center of these successes. As Tip goes, so go the Browns, or so it seemed. I'll begin with Tip's early years before his major league career and end with post-career years in Montreal. I have the same hope for my presentation tonight as I did for my book, which was namely that the story I tell of O'Neill's 1880 season reclaims and revives a legacy that is much deserved, but not yet fully appreciated. But before I get into some of the details about this season, I want to begin with some of the way Tip has been honored in Canada. In 1983, he was one of 3 players inducted into the first class of the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. A year later, that same hall established the Tip O'Neill Award, presented annually to the Canadian player judged to have excelled in individual achievement and team contribution while adhering to baseball ideals. A decade later, he was inducted into Canada's Sports Hall of Fame. There are only 8 Major League Baseball players in the Canada Sports Hall of Fame, and only 3 of which are position players. George Gibson from the early 1900s, a catcher, Larry Walker, recently inducted into Cooperstown, and Tip O'Neill. Let's go back 162 years to the birth of James Edward O'Neill, May 15th, 1860, in Springfield, Ontario. On the left side of the screen, you see a picture of young Tip of around 6-7 years of age. He likely just had moved to Woodstock, which is where he spent most of his youth from that point on. On the right, you see his father's hotel, the O'Neill House. His father was a hotel keeper, and they moved around quite a bit in the early years of Tip's life. So, in effect, Tip has grown up in, or did grow up in hotels and pubs Seems to me that's pretty good preparation for life as a baseball player later on. In any case, Tip began his baseball career formally in 1877. Here we see Tip in 1879. He was the leading pitcher of the Woods, and the background is the Woodstock Driving Park, a horse racing venue. It was the site of the 1875 Queen's Plate, Canada's premier horse race. The father was one of the major organizers of that event, and Tip helped Dad. And it's the start of a lifelong interest in horse racing for Tip. Tip also, on special days during the year, played baseball games in this driving park. He was a pitcher from 1877 to 1881, amateur pitcher, lead batsman for the team and captain of the Woodstock Actives. The Actives won the Canadian Amateur Championship in 1878. This was the period of time, in my view, is when he got his nickname Tip. It first appeared in the Woodstock Sentinel Review in 1879. Just before that, Tip appeared on stage in a production of the farce Tip and the Slasher. Tip played the role of, O'Neill played the role of Tip. His less than stellar performance drew catcalls from some of his teammates in attendance. From that point on, O'Neill's mates called him Tip. Tip was a pitcher for a total of 8 years, 5 years with the Woodstock Actives, and then he moved to New York in 1882 and was one of the pitchers in the New York Metropolitans, which at that time they played in the League Alliance, although they had many exhibition games with National League teams and American Association teams. In his first year, he had a 25-10 record, a pretty good start for a young guy. Moved to New York Gotham's the next year, which was the National League. Struggled a little more in that particular season and was sent to what was an unofficial minor league team of the New York franchises in Hartford. And he pitched another 12 or 13 games there, 2 of which were no-hitters. He moved to St. Louis in 1884. He was a starting day pitcher. By June, he had an 11-4 record, but his perennial arm problems were just getting worse. And although for years they had always claimed he had great promise and was he was a speedball thrower, I suppose you'd call him, he had to retire from pitching. And even though at that point he was leading the Browns in batting, Comiskey, the team manager and captain, assigned Tip to left field for the remainder of the season. Though not obvious at the time, this change was one of the key moves that brought both the Browns and Tip great success in the years to come. In his first 2 years as the regular left fielder for the St. Louis Browns, the Browns themselves won 2 American Association championships. They were in 2 world championships, tying Chicago in '85 and beating them in '86, 4-2. In 1885, by the middle of June, Tip was leading the American Association in batting with an average of .381, and then he suffered a bad leg injury that put him out for most of the rest of the season. He came back briefly late in September and played a little bit in the World Series, but he had to wait for '86 for a full season. And what a full season it was. He blossomed into one of the leading batsmen in the American Association. He was in the race for the batting title until the last month and ended up finishing 3rd. In field, it took a while to learn how to play left field on a day-to-day basis, but he became fairly effective at it in '86, was durable, a reliable fly catcher, and a savvy outfielder. His main weakness was his arm. He never really recovered through the rest of his career the strength that he once had. Consequently, he had fairly modest numbers for the throwing categories of an outfielder, namely assists and double plays. He did receive periodic criticism for his base running or running in general. As you see on the left side at the top, well, first of all, he had good foot speed. He often beat some of the other players on the team in a foot race, but he had a very slow start, both when he was trying to steal a base as well as going after fly balls. Hence, in 1888, the cartoon of Tip on the couch in left field was a comment that they saw his slow start as a sign of laziness, and they would periodically get on him for not being the fielder, the same fielder as, say, his center fielder was. He also had problems stealing bases, in part because he didn't slide. He didn't slide until 1888, and even after that, only infrequently. You'll see a cartoon at the bottom from an 1892, his last year, Cincinnati newspaper. That's Comiskey on the horse, and he's pulling Tip along behind, presumably in sliding practice. He also had occasionally was caught with bad judgment on base, getting picked off by a pitcher or a catcher, what they called caught napping in those days. And sometimes he was exuberant about his own hits, trying to make a triple out of a double, and got thrown out in doing so. He also failed to run on certain plays if he thought it was a ball that was going to be an out, or it was going to be a third out if he was on the base pass. And Comiskey took him aside and corrected the error of his ways on that one. Despite reservations about his running, though, fans thoroughly enjoyed Tip's stellar performance on offense and defense in 1886, and were even more ecstatic by his leading role in the Browns' win over Chicago in the World Championship. Tip led all batters in batting average, extra base hits, and total bases. He hit 2 home runs in a 12-0 shellacking of Chicago. He also had 13 putouts and no errors, the only outfielder with 10 or more putouts to play error-free. Tip clearly was a favorite of the St. Louis fans. They had high hopes for Tip and the Browns in the 87 season. Tip did not disappoint. He excelled beyond all expectation. Before I turn to his season, I want to say a word about the St. Louis Browns style of play. They were clearly a talented team. The New York Times commented the Browns covered plenty of ground, took desperate chances while on the field, ran the bases daringly, and handled their bats to good advantage. Lots of skill and hustle there. However, they were also an aggressive team, and probably exemplified in Comiskey's phrase, anything to win, which was really a call to arms to press on every front and by any means to win the game. One of his quotes that appear on the slide on the top left, he often went back to this motto that he had for his team. This aggressive style was exemplified through things like noisy coaching, kicking, tricks, and rough play, what those around the league called dirty ball. The 1887 season was a rowdy year, full of coarse and rough plays, especially but not only by the Browns. Let's look at some of these. The boss kicker was the captain, the manager. He led the way in challenging the umpire on any calls against the Browns or unfair tactics against opposing teams. He obviously wanted to overturn the call, but in other times he simply wanted to instill a sense of guilt or debt in the umpire so that he would make up for his error in judgment by ruling in the Browns' favor on a close play later in the game. On the right side, you see a team kick. The Browns relatively often would leave the bench and surround the umpire to express their displeasure with one of his calls. The Browns were also noisy on the coaching lines, led by the third baseman, Arlie Latham, who was famous for his loud chatter, hence the cartoon with a wide open mouth. Bantering style, he made fun of opposing players, fans, and even umpires. He danced a jig and did somersaults. He was just always in motion, whether it's his mouth or his body. He just didn't stop from beginning to end. Quite amusing for most fans in all of the cities, but that was in contrast to Comiskey and Bill Gleason, the shortstop, who also took their turn coaching at first and third. They spent more time yelling about calls or calling down opposing players. In one early game, the two of them came in on either side of the catcher, yelling insults and ridiculing his catching ability. Such moves were all meant to distract or rattle either the catcher or the pitchers to the point that they would make a mistake. Browns were also famous for tricks, and I think second baseman Bill Yank Robinson led the department here. I'll mention two examples. The one cutting third base when on offense. So one example, he was on second, one out, ball hit on the ground to the third baseman. On the throw to first, Robinson took off towards third. Suddenly he cuts across the diamond, missing third base by 15 feet and heads straight to home. He scored what proved to be the winning run. The umpire declared him safe because he was watching the play at first. On another situation on defense, he regularly tried to bluff runners, either in a tag or an incoming throw. Another example, opposing runner was on second, the ball thrown by the catcher to Robinson to pick off the runner. The runner dove back to the bag, but the ball skipped out into center field, unknown to the runner, didn't know where the ball was. Robbins, however, tagged the runner and then jumped in the air, raised his glove in celebration of the out, yelling at the umpire to confirm the call. The runner took the bait, jumped up, and argued that he was safe. His teammates shouted at the runner to run to third, but were drowned out by the laughter in the crowd. And finally, rough plays. Again, quite a few players engaged in rough plays, but the main protagonist in my books, at least, is the rough and tumble play of the center fielder, Kurt Welsh. And I'll speak to an example that reflects the cartoon on the far right. They were in Baltimore, and it was the bottom of the eighth, score tied 8-8, one out, Welsh on first. He took off to steal second. Greenwood, the second baseman, received the ball in plenty of time to tag Welsh. However, Welsh veered off the path line and knocked Greenwood, sending him flying backwards, and he lay on the ground dazed and stunned by the blow. The crowd was incensed, many of them jumping onto the field and rushing at Welsh. The mayor's secretary was in the crowd and ordered the police to arrest Welsh, which they did on a charge of assault, and escorted him to jail. The play for the game was suspended. The next day, the assault charge was dropped. He was found guilty of disorderly conduct, fined $1, and costs, which were paid by the owner, Chris Vonderai. The St. Louis Sunday Saying observed of this particular incident, Kurt Welsh is the first ball player ever to be arrested for stealing a base. On defense, Welsh and Robinson took turns at punching runners as they rounded second base. Welsh would sneak in from center field on a pickoff play and then block the base as he was trying to get back and rough him up on the play. Or if the second baseman and shortstop were away from their bags and an opposing player was coming around second, he would run in and slug the runner in the chest, hoping to stop him at second so he wouldn't go on further. While many of the fans enjoyed Brown's aggressive style of play, they appreciated Tip for different reasons. Tip did not coach. He rarely kicked over calls, though he joined in team kicks. He tried a few tricks, but usually unsuccessfully, and left the rough plays to others. The fans looked to Tip for aggression at the plate, where he did everything to win with his bat. Finally, getting to some of the numbers and the feats of the '87 season. Quick comment on the Browns. The Browns won the championship again for the third time in a row, 14 games ahead of second place Cincinnati. For the first time, they lost the World Championship to Detroit in a 15-game marathon. Detroit won 10 of the 15 games. It was a significant year for rule change. Never before and never again did the game undergo as many changes as occurred in 1887, so said David Nemrick in his 19th century encyclopedia. There were quite a few rules that favored the batsman, but one of these rule changes proved quite controversial, and it only lasted 1 year. It was a scoring rule. Base on balls were going to be then scored as a hit and a time at bat, which in turn meant that most batsmen could look forward to higher batting averages than in previous years. A second rule only lasted a year when they moved 3 to 4 strikes, but this one didn't receive as much criticism as the base on ball change. So Tip, in his one-of-a-kind season, distinguished himself as a batsman who could hit for both average and power. 492 was the official average reported in the Reach American Association baseball guide. That was the photo of Tip rather that appeared in that guide. 488 below is the average that came out of my research. I didn't quite find 492, but obviously close. You can go to Total Baseball, and it shows Tip's average is 485. And if you look further into many of the databases, Baseball Reference, Retro Sheets, Fangraphs, etc., it shows his average is 435. These particular databases exclude base on balls as hits or times at bat. But not all of those sources agree on the average. For example, the Elias Book of Baseball Records, Elias Bureau's official statistician, Major League Baseball, lists Tip's average as 442. Regardless whichever average you believe, he still is one of only 21 batters to have hit over 400 or higher in one season. It happened 28 times. A few other batters did it more than once. In terms of his power feats, most of those were connected to the record he set for extra base hits. He had 8 extra base hits that season, a record that stood for 33 years until someone named Babe Ruth hit 99 in 1920. In 1921, the Babe set the all-time record of 119 extra base hits. Tip also led the league in batting average, home run, and RBI, and thus is one of only 15 batters ever to win the Triple Crown. He's one of only 4 batsmen to hit 2 cycles in one season, and he's tied with John Riley for the fastest 2 cycles, completing the feat in a 5-game period. He's the only player ever to lead the league in all 3 extra base hit categories, doubles, triples, home runs in the single season. A number of people have led in the league in 2 of those 3, but not all 3. And finally, his long hit streak, long hit referring to extra base hits. His record he set a record with 1 or more extra base hits in 12 games in a row. This record was broken in 1927 by Paul Wainer, who had an extra base hit in 14 consecutive games. Chipper Jones tied that record in 2006. And so Tip and Rogers Hornsby are in second place with 12 consecutive games with a long hit. Tip, while popular with the fans in '86, he became a local hero. So says some of the St. Louis sports historians. They not only admired him at the bat, but they enjoyed his character and his good looks. And so all the ingredients of a good hero. And they showed their appreciation and support for their hero in all kinds of ways. I'll mention just 2 of them. The admiration of young boys. In home games, the Browns had the habit of parading from one of the owner's pubs to Sportsman Park. And boys gathered around the beginning of that parade with the hope of trying to be the person Tip would choose to carry his bat bag. The boys also played on teams named after Tip, Little O'Neill's, Young Tip. And then following from what I said at the first of this presentation, boys with the surname O'Neill often adopted the nickname of Tip. So did Norris Tip O'Neill, a minor league player and manager and president of the Western League, and Bill Tip O'Neill, who played in the major leagues in the first decade of the 20th century. He enjoyed much chatter and banter in left field with the ladies behind him. They would often ask him to hit the ball for him or to her if possible. The Sporting News reported on one of these incidents. One fair beauty was sitting close to Tip O'Neill's pasture and asked him to knock a ball out to her when he was next at the bat so that she might catch him out. The Browns' great slugger promised the young lady he would give her a chance, and he was as good as his word. The sphere went sailing on a line from the home plate to the young lady, But instead of making an effort to catch it, she attempted to get out of the way, and it struck her square in the bustle. The young lady now takes her meals standing. Whether such tales were accurate, embellished, or simply made up, they all form part of the lore and legend of Tip O'Neill, their local hero. I want to go back to Nemec's quote that I cited at the beginning of my presentation, where he said, "O'Neill rocketed perhaps the most dominant offensive season in history." Well, how dominant was Tip's single season batting performance in comparison to batsmen in his era being 1876 to 1892, or in fact to batsmen in other eras? There's many ways to compare batsmen, and I looked at some of the sabermetrics and their fascinating categories, but I chose a simpler measure of dominance, one that was more in line with the era in which Tip played. I focused on firsts. I counted the number of firsts Tip achieved, initially in terms of the number of batting categories in which Tip led both the league and the major leagues. I then counted the number of records he set in each category in which he led. So first, for my purposes, has a double meaning: leading and record breaking. These are Tip's stats for 1887. As you can see, with this, he led the American Association in 11 of 12 categories, not in singles. LH is long hits or extra base hits again. And in the major leagues, combined with the American Association and the National League together, he led in 8 categories for a total of 19 leads or firsts in those 12 batting categories. He set single league records in 10 of the 11 categories in which he led in the American Association, and in all 8 categories that he led in the major leagues for a total of 18 records. As an aside, the Browns also led all American Association teams in 11 of 12 categories, in their case, not triples, and in 7 categories in the major leagues. And so it was a dominant year for the Browns as well. How does Tip's season compare to batsmen who also had exemplary seasons in this era? Well, there are many great seasons between 1876 and 92, but when considered in terms of rankings or firsts, one stands out: Dan Brothers' 1883 season in the National League. He led in 9 categories in the National League and 9 in the major leagues for a total of 18, one behind Tip's total of 19, and one ahead of the number of categories he led in the major leagues. But in the other first, namely records, Tip's total of 18 records exceeds that of Brothers by a substantial margin. Brothers broke 7 records in total, 9 in the National League and 3 in the Major League. There are other good seasons. Ross Barnes in 76 and Fred Dunlop in the Union Association in 84 both had numbers that would come close to Brothers and O'Neill, but and if you want to talk about them in the later in the questions, we can do so. Well, let's widen the comparison to batsmen in other eras. For this list, I went to batsmen who had at least were leading in at least 10 out of the 12 categories that I showed you a few seconds ago for Tip. And you'll notice that the 6 listed there are all in the Hall of Fame and all prominent batsmen in their eras. I didn't include a column for the league lead, but I can deal with that very quickly. Nap Lajoie also led in 11 out of 12 categories, tying Tip for the most. All the rest on that list had led in 10 categories. But when you combine the number of times they led in the league and the major league, 4 of them tie with 19 leads in those categories. But like Brothers, when you compare Tip's record-breaking firsts, he also exceeds the rest on that list by a substantial margin. Ty Cobb leads in 6 in total, 5 in the American League and 1 in the Major League. Roger Hornsby led in five categories, all in the National League. I have an asterisk beside Lajoie because while I count them as records, I have to remind us that that was the first year of the American League. And so by leading in those 11 categories, you automatically set the records. And a number of those records stayed for quite a few years. And so they were certainly a strong season on his part. Tip truly had a season of firsts. He not only ranked first in most of the most batting categories in the league and major league, tied with Lechois for the league best and with 3 others for the total. Many of these numbers and percentages were record-breaking firsts, an achievement that distinguished him from the other batsmen on this list, who also had tremendous seasons. Back to Nimit's claim, O'Neill rocketed perhaps the most dominant offensive season in history. Well, I personally would take out the word perhaps. With the most first ever batting records, Tip is clearly first among equals, at least in a one season comparison. Moving on to, wrong way. Moving on to Tip's last 5 years in the major leagues, he spent 3 of them with the Browns in 80, 89, and 91. 1 with the Chicago Pirates in the Players League in 1890, and his last year with Cincinnati Reds in the National League in 92. The Browns won their 4th American Association Championship in a row, but lost to New York Giants in the World Championships. And the only other point I want to make on his batting before I move on to the finer stage of his career. Oh, the other thing to say about Tip is that he won the batting championship again in 88. So that was 2 years in a row. And he's one of 4 people who have done that. Hines also did it in 78, 79, Brothers in 82, 83, and Anson in 87 and 88, all in the National League. One final comment on Tip's batting record, more generally from 85 to 92, the 8 years that he was a left fielder and a full-time batsman. Some have argued Tip has only had 1 great season, or perhaps a softer version of this is that he had never had another season like 87. Well, that may be true. He was still one of the best batsmen in the American Association and the Major League between 1885 and 1891. 92 was a different matter altogether. Let me just give you a few numbers to illustrate. In batting average, in the American Association, Tip was in the top 3 in all 6 years that he played with St. Louis. First in 87, 88, second in 89, third in 85, 86, and 91. In the major leagues, he was in the top 5 in 5 of his 8 seasons. First in 87, second in 88, fourth in 85 and 91, and fifth in 89. He hit 300 or better for 7 seasons. Only 3 batsmen in this era did better. Anson with a whopping 15, Brothers 12, and Ewing 8. Another way to look at his broader batting record is to look at cumulative numbers. And I have these multiple charts comparing different 3-year segments, 4-year segments, 5-year segments, 6-year segments. I'll give you 3 examples. In the 3-year period from 87 to 89, Tip led the American Association and the major leagues in 9 batting categories: hits, doubles, runs batted in, total bases, on-base percentage, slugging percentage, OPS, and BA. In the 5-year period from 85 to 89, he led the American Association in 7 categories. In the same 5-year period, 85 to 89, he led the major leagues in batting average and was in the top 3 in hits, runs batted in, slugging, and OPS, and 4th in total bases. And finally, in the 7-year period, 85 to 91, he led the major leagues in hits and was tied for batting average, 2nd in runs batted in, and 3rd in OPS. But all things must come to an end, and in 1892, his career abruptly concluded. He struggled through most of that season in Cincinnati, battling through illness, injury, and conflict with Comiskey. He clearly was no hero in Cincinnati. He returned to Woodstock before the season ended. In poor health, with sore ribs and dragging a weak stick, Tip walked away from Comiskey, Cincinnati, and Major League Baseball with no permission sought, no notice given, no line sent or received, and no glance back. On to his next chapter in life, which was in Montreal. He stayed connected to baseball for the rest of his life. He served as an umpire in the Eastern League when Montreal Royals began in that league in the mid-90s. He was advisor to Joe Page, who was often referred to as the father of baseball in Quebec, and helped Joe in many of his initiatives. He was an advisor to his brother, who was vice president and then president of the Royals. He did short stints as manager and coach of local teams. He was a scout for some of the major league teams, and a celebrity, going to many of the old timers games around the major leagues. All in support of the game he loved and in the development of baseball in Quebec. He continued his lifelong interest in horse racing. He and his brother set up a bookmaking stand in Sheepshead Bay near New York, and also in Toronto and Montreal around big races. They had two family businesses, a Hoffman Cafe he ran with his brother George, and with two of his brothers, they established a cigar making company, Pug Cigars. He died on New Year's Eve, getting off a streetcar of a heart attack. His brother and sister took him back to Woodstock, and he was buried at a family plot outside of that city. Tributes poured in for the first couple months of 1916 as different newspapers around North America honored his passing. Some of the quotes are before you. I've highlighted some of the things that many of the tributes included. I want to read one more from Charles Comiskey. Charles Comiskey was Tip's manager and captain in the 8 years that Tip played left field for St. Louis, the Chicago Pirates, and Cincinnati. On Tip's death, he said, baseball lost one of its greatest exponents when Tip passed away. I'm sorry to learn of his death, for in addition to being the equal of Anson as a natural batter, he always conducted himself in a gentlemanly manner, and for that reason was perhaps the most popular player the St. Louis public ever knew. My tribute builds on one of the expressions you saw there, original Tip. Once Tip retired, there seemed to be a lot of confusion sometimes about reports of Tip. I think 3 different newspapers from 1894 to 1915 reported his death in different parts of North America. Some called him, to differentiate Tip from other Tips, they called him the original Tip, Tip the First, or the only Tip. The last 5 sentences in my book, as you'll see, my first slide is really just an early version of what became the cover of my book. To bring closure to this narrative, I return to the latter-day amplifications of his nickname, the original Tip, Tip the First, and the only Tip. First, James O'Neill was the original Tip by the very fact that he was the earliest batsman with this nickname. All others were but poor pretenders. Second, he was Tip the First in that he led the association of major leagues in more batting categories and with more record-breaking numbers or percentages in one season than any batsman in the history of the game. And last but not least, only Tip has ever recorded a batting average of 48 or 492 or 485, the highest single season batting average in the major league since 1876. My final slide shows Tip from various old judge cards in various positions, either at bat, in the field, or throwing. I conclude by going back to my opening statement of hope. And that is, I hope that the story I tell of O'Neill's 87th season reclaims and revives a legacy that is much deserved, and now I hope better appreciated. And I thank you for your time. Sorry for the problems at the beginning.
Dennis, thank you. Thank you for that lot of material there to grasp and how all the things that Tip O'Neill did as somebody sometimes is not always thought of as one of the top players out there. Early in your talk, you mentioned that O'Neill didn't slide, or at least in the early part of his career. didn't slide. Was there a reason he didn't slide?
I don't know, because I never got to the bottom of that, because Comiskey was, he regularly would have sliding practice, and he might have done it in practice, but in game time he just never did. And he had surprisingly good base stealing numbers for someone who didn't slide. He just never had cause to do so, I don't think, as an amateur. And in his days as pitching, he wasn't batting enough to be in that position too often, I guess. But I don't really know why.
I only know of one other player particularly in the 19th century, who didn't slide. And that was Pete Browning.
Okay.
He was a non-slider. His reason was he didn't want to hurt his legs because he wanted to bat.
Right.
He wanted to be able to hit.
Yeah.
Although he seemed to have good speed, because he often was at top of the league in steals. These was during the time when they counted taking an extra base,
Right.
going from first to third on a single as a stolen base. And he had put up some relatively gaudy numbers and had good speed, but he just had his own ideas. He wasn't going to slide, and there are several articles that talk about him being tagged out if he had slid on a high throw or something.
That's right. The same was true with Tip, but I don't know the reason. He never made an expression that I know of, like Browning did, to explain it. I think he just probably worried about injuries too, I suspect, but because he did have a number of injuries. He was out the first few years, 12 to 15 games a season with leg injury or hand injuries of one type or another. So
Browning would miss them, but for different reasons. Bent the elbow too much. A question from Bill Felber. Would there be a way of normalizing the number of records O'Neill set versus, for example, Musial, to account for the fact that when Tip played, the league was only a decade old, whereas Musial played in the league was 3/4 of a century old?
Oh, I think that's a fair comment. I don't think it. So I think probably the comparison of just how many batting categories you led in is probably more relevant. Although I would add, though, that people in that era had every opportunity to do something as great as Tip did in terms of both leading in batting categories and setting records, and that just didn't happen, at least not to the degree that he did. But certainly, as you accumulate over the years, I think the number of times people break records diminishes by quite a bit, and so that's a fair comment. Although, as I say, I still think ending up first in each of those categories still is a helpful comparative measure, because it is a comparison only to those with in the same season, under the same rules and the same set of conditions, and then seeing how other people in their season compare to their peers is the basis of comparison. So
Jeff Orner made a comment. He was looking at the old judge cards that you had displayed there, and he noticed that many of them spell O'Neill's name with one L. Was that a kind of a chronic thing?
That was very common. In fact, they would reverse E and I together as well. And actually, in terms of his birthplace, once they found out he was from Springfield, a number of places reported he was born in Massachusetts, especially during the time that he won the batting championship, which was interesting, because the person who put the '88 Reach Guide together was the secretary of the St. Louis Browns. And in his summary on the page opposite that picture of Tip, he said he was born in Massachusetts. So I never understood why that was as much a mistake. I could understand the spelling of the name, I guess, but there was lots of O'Neills in the United States as well, so I'm not sure why.
And confusing Springfields, there's got to be 1 to 4 of them in every state in the United States.
Yes.
They're everywhere.
And a few in Canada as well. So
yeah, I know. I grew up in New Jersey, and there's 5 towns named Washington. I have no idea where that came from. Who would know of colonial times? That's all the questions. Do you have anything? Would you like to display those last statistical slides, or if there's anything to add there? Or
Well, this was just the one slide in case people wanted to know a bit more about the rule changes, because they were kind of unique. And I actually, in the Fred, I'm going to speak more about the rule changes in the presentation I'm doing on 1887. So if you're interested in rule changes, and because this is a season that the base on balls was kind of abused quite a bit, and in some ways I'm going to make a counter argument that was kind of a fascinating innovation in and of itself for a number of obvious reasons. Then what I did here is just separated out the two tables. I just didn't want to have that many tables in the regular presentation. You can see the leading numbers broken down more clearly here, and then the records broken down in this one. I just took this column and put it into the second table. So anyways, that
if anybody wants to see more detail or study those slides a little bit, they will be posted in the next couple of days on the SABR website with the recording of this presentation. Sid Finch, a name of some repute, must be from New Jersey. He says New Jersey has 7 Springfields, a Washington Township, and also several Washington boroughs. I've been gone for 55 years, so although I suspect they haven't renamed any towns. I did go. One of our big rivals in high school was Jonathan Dayton High School in Springfield, New Jersey. They were terrible people. Not as bad as Westfield, but Springfield was not our favorite. Dennis, thank you very much. It was very elucidating,
my pleasure.
very interesting. So some more to chew on. If you want to close up all your slides, just keep hitting X on your corner there. We'll get out of that view.
is it out?
No, you're not fully out. If you up on view, up at the top, there's view options. Hold on. There we go. There it is.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Very good. Peter, if you'd give us our close.
Dennis, I think your hope is realized, because you certainly breathed new life into Tip O'Neill for sure, but that 1887 season. I just finished doing a lot of research and writing on Dude Estabrook, who played for the Metropolitans also in that 1882 season. So I was just curious about that. It struck me. I wasn't really paying too much attention to who some of the other players were, but obviously Tip O'Neill was one.
Yes.
All right, thank you so much.
Peter, may I interrupt for just a moment? I neglected. I got going there. I think one question from Gary Groh. How was the Browns field configured, and how were the various fields of the American Association configured? And thank you on a wonderful presentation. Was there any field adjustment that would have benefited him, or that he had overcome?
Well, they had a relatively short, in terms of size of the park and that sort of thing. The park itself was fairly over 400 in center, about 450 down left, but about 290 down right. But they added a 10-foot fence for the 87 season to try to make right field a little tougher. But it's fair to say that Tip did much better at Sportsman Park. Even in that year, he batted .530 at Sportsman Park, hit 64 of his 88 extra base hits there, and batted a paltry .436 in away games. So I think the park factor that some people have applied to some of the statistics in Baseball Reference kind of verifies that the park itself. Although I don't think it was, I mean, as you know, with some of them cavernous parks is probably explains why there were so many triples. Like Tip had like 22 triples and 14 home runs, and it wasn't unusual to see those kinds of numbers where someone had more triples than home runs. So anything else, I mean, they still had the beer garden in right field, but I think they had a fence closing most of it off. For the first few years, a ball hit into the beer garden was live, and so you had to run in and have a quick sip and throw it back to the pitcher before it was in play again. So
That make it look like a steeplechase race. Yeah, there are obstacles to overcome. Thank you for that, for
Okay.
clarifying that. Peter, to you.
Dennis, I have a question.
okay.
This is Mitch. Yeah, those 5 cards, do you own them?
The 5 old
Those
Judge.
5 old Judge cigarette cards, are those yours? Are they part of
No,
your
no, I
collection?
have. I bought images of them. I have one of them,
Oh,
and I have another. I have another Tip O'Neill card from that I displayed earlier. So I have 2 or 3 Tip cards, but no, I don't have those ones.
okay.
They're a little
Just out of
expensive.
curiosity. Yeah, worth many, many thousands of dollars.
Yes, they
Tens
are.
of thousands
Yes.
of dollars.
If they're in good
Okay.
shape, for sure.
Yeah, those are in pretty good shape.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good.
Okay,
Okay.
I also have a question on a slightly different matter, if you guys might indulge me. When the New York Giants inaugural season of 1883, I think they became the Giants around 1886 or so,
85.
85. Were they known as the Mutuals or the Gothams?
What was, sorry, say that again.
When the Giants first organized in 1883, were they
Gothams.
known as the Mutuals or the Gothams?
The Gotham.
Oh, they were the Gothams. So the team they had in 1876 was the Mutuals.
Yes, that was a different team. You know,
Yeah, I
that was
know,
a
it's totally different
yeah,
team.
national
I get
team.
them confused, that's all.
Yeah.
All right, so, okay, so it was the Mutuals of 1876 and the Gothams of 1883 to 1885. Do I have it right?
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay. Happen to know that.
Okay, well, thank you, okay.
Let me go on with a few things here. First, thanks again, Dennis. Thank you very, very much. Terry Bound, am I saying that right, Terry? I know you were here before.
That's pronounced bone.
Bond?
Bone.
Oh, all right. All right, Terry will be presenting next month on April the 12th, Tuesday night, on another interesting topic, because we were back to a very beginning of our season where we had Bruce Alderas did a presentation on baseball in the Old West, and Terry has taken a piece of the Old West, and it's called Bushels of Fun: Early Baseball in the Black Hills. And you know, they really are black when you when you're approaching them across the prairie. So we'll see you next month, Terry. That's for sure. Thank you. Coming up, the Frederick Iver Campbell 19th Century Baseball Conference. There are still a limited number of seats left. I think we're going to come up to, I don't know if it will be our all-time record. This is the first time we're back live since 2019. So we are really looking forward to it. I will tell you that SABR has instituted a policy that requires proof of vaccination, but there is a system that SABR has. So if you register and you've been vaccinated, you'll get an email from SABR that'll, put you into their system. Very simple to do. As of yesterday, I was informed by the Baseball Hall of Fame that their mask mandate has been lifted, and what they have done is only make masking optional right as of today, and or as of yesterday, and they just recommend that you wear a mask, but there's no obligation to. So, but we will have a completely vaccinated attendees, number of attendees. So if you want to just go online, go to the SABR website to events, and you can click on the 19th Century Baseball Conference for all the details of registering if you like. So we're looking very good on the Fred, and we're very excited about it being live again. We just set a record with our Overlook Legends election for the primary. We had 227 members of our committee vote in the primary election for 2022. And that came out to 33.8% of our total of just under 700 members of the committee. So more than a third, or just slightly more than a third of our membership voted in that primary election. I'm very excited about that in a sense. And the fellows who did that election, by the way, you'll see it in June. You'll see who the finalists are. They did it very different this year, where they put in 4 categories that included early baseball pioneers, regular players that appeared later in league play, black baseball, and a category for umpires, managers, and executives. So it was a really interesting way they went about it, and they have come up with 12 finalists with each category represented. So it's pretty exciting. You look for that in June. That'll be out in June. I want to mention that in a week or two, I'll be sending out again. Bob and I will be sending out our call for abstracts for this 19th Century Baseball Speaker Series. And we're hoping that we'll be able, by the end of April, to be able to begin our selection process and our jurying process of the abstracts that are sent in. So keep an eye out for our committee email from us with that abstract attached. And don't forget, SABR has just announced that the National Convention registration is open. It'll be the first time, I think, since 2019 that there's been a live national convention. So that'll be in Baltimore this year in August. And all the details are on the SABR website. And last but not least, don't ever get involved with the Rhode Island chapter of SABR, because they are so professional, so well organized, that they run 100 miles an hour when you're running 80. But anyway, our committee, our 19th Century committee, along with the Southern New England chapter of SABR, headquartered in Providence, along with Rhode Island College, all 3 of us are co-sponsors of, on November 12th, our 19th Century Baseball Interdisciplinary Symposium. And the Rhode Island chapter people have put together a program that is incredible. The names. So that'll be, you'll see a little bit of that come out in the spring newsletter, and you'll be able to begin registering that with the publication of our summer newsletter around July 1st. So we'll get, that's all coming into motion. And I'm pleased to have Len Levin here tonight because he's the chapter president. And Len, your people are wonderful up there. They're just incredible. All right, and I think that's it. That's the news for tonight. Bob, thank you again for honchoing this and putting this whole program together. And I thank everybody for joining us.
Good night, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Good night.
Bye now.
Thanks, Bob.